Welcome to a 1.5 inch scale Allchin Royal Chester traction engine renovation. This is a bonus feature to the main series, edited highlights from every episode, showing the slow but sure transformation of this very well made small traction engine. Frequently I receive comments from YouTube viewers complaining that the videos are not long enough. Just for a change, this one is nearly 39 minutes long. I think that a lot of the comments come in from viewers who don't watch the normal length videos right to the end, where I say this. By using the playlists, you can actually watch the videos back to back. There is more information overall by watching the individual episodes, or you can of course sit for 39 minutes approximately and watch the full series edited. This is a 1.5 inch scale Allchin Royal Chester traction engine. Here it is in my second workshop, the one that's attached to the house, and the first thing I'm doing is lubricating every moving part. This engine shows evidence of having been steamed frequently. I can see this by looking in the smoke box. The owner told me that he bought this engine via Facebook Marketplace, and he got it for a very good price indeed. And the current owner has no intention of steaming it. He just wants it as a display item that he can occasionally run on compressed air. And now a health and safety warning disclaimer. The boiler of this small traction engine does not have a boiler certificate. Physically, the boiler looks to be very well made, but I do not recommend pressurizing any boiler that doesn't have a test certificate. Once I've done some of the mechanical work, as I go along, I'm going to clean a lot of these parts that you can see. For instance, the paint on this gear selector is very badly chipped, and the best thing to do is scrape it all off and start again. This is a very interesting traction engine of a type that I've not seen before. It will only turn right, you can't turn left. That's because the chain's broken off. Even though this engine is very small, it's extremely detailed. This nut underneath the big end pulls down the taper pin to tighten the bearing brasses. I'm using a very small spanner to tighten it, and I'm being very careful not to shear it off. I'm using a Stanley knife and a hammer to break the seal between the decorative cover and the proper cylinder cover. Once the thin Stanley knife blade had broken the seal, I very carefully levered it off using a small screwdriver. This causes minimal damage to the paintwork around the cylinder. Any minor damage to the existing paint can be rectified by just repainting it before I fit the cylinder cover back in place. The area around the drain cocks is very dirty and the drain cocks are stuck fast. The union nuts are not tight at all, and it was a very simple job to undo the nuts to release the pipes. I didn't feel that this cleaning solution was strong enough, so I added a little bit of Carbusonic to it. This is quite a powerful detergent. And this mixture of water, soap, alcohol and Carbusonic should easily remove the dirt and grime from the engine. I still have quite a long way to go on this engine yet, and I haven't found any serious problems. In the next episode I'm going to remove one of the rear wheels. And it's currently being cleaned with a paintbrush with my special solution at 4 times normal speed. I mentioned the components in the liquid in the previous episode and the reason for using a soft pastry brush to clean the parts. When this engine was built, it looks like one of the nuts sheared off, which is not surprising because these studs are very small. 7 or even maybe 8 BA, very small indeed. I've always thought that the way traction engine wheels are held onto the axle is a very simple and very clever way of doing it. It's just a collar and a pin. With the wheel removed, I can clean behind it. Once again using my solution of soap, alcohol and a little bit of Carbusonic cleaner. My pastry brush removes the dirt but doesn't damage the paintwork. If you look at this image, you will see that the paint is quite badly damaged in places, and there will be one future episode at least showing the repairs to the paintwork. In this clip I'm showing how the hubcap holds the pin in place so the collar can't fall off and in turn the wheel can't fall off. Very simple, very clever. This hole that you can see in the main boiler, not to be confused with all the plating around the boiler which is steel, is where the blowdown valve fits. This is to blow down the boiler after a run to get rid of all the limescale and rubbish from between the inner and outer firebox of the boiler. And this is quite incredible. It is a working blowdown valve. I thought at first it was a dummy, but it's not. The stainless steel end part screws out to drain the water. At this side, the hubcap is slightly different to the other side, and there are two pins that are removable. To extract the pins, you need to remove two flat split pins, and it's impossible to take off the hubcap until these are removed. So here we go, split pin number 1 out of the way. Now I can withdraw drive pin number 1, closely followed by drive pin number 2. I gave this other wheel a preliminary clean, and now they're both on the bench ready to transfer into the kitchen sink. A lot of traction engines were fitted with winch drums on the main driving axle to the wheel. I'm continuing with the cleaning on this side of the engine, and I'm using the same pastry brush with a very small amount of Carbusonic carburetor cleaner liquid on it. I'm being very careful because I do not wish to damage or remove the paint. In this clip I'm cleaning the locking mechanism and the winch drum. The winch drum is a nice easy fit on the main drive gear. When I turned the wheels by hand, the differential was working, but it was quite stiff. Whatever oil or grease was originally applied to this differential, it's long since gone. There is slight damage to most of the paintwork here and there, but there's a lot of damage on the flywheel. Have a look near the spokes, the paint's really come loose and flaked off. The white paint on the centre boss and round the rim of the flywheel is okay, this will overpaint, but being so badly chipped, the brown paint on the body of the flywheel needs to be removed, and the easiest way to do this is to use the point of a Stanley knife blade. I've put a cloth behind the flywheel to stop the paint chippings flying everywhere, and at this point I would like to say that I am wearing eye protection, but it's getting difficult to breathe with this carrier bag over my head. Once again, with the pastry brush almost dry, I'm cleaning the boiler barrel, and the paintwork on the barrel is very good. This is the blowdown valve. I need to remove the paint, so I've dropped it in a pot of cellulose thinners or lacquer thinner, and it shouldn't be too long before I end up with just a nice looking brass part. Here are the wheels on the bench in the workshop, and as you can see they are in a bit of a state. The paint on the strakes is very rough indeed, and quite a lot of it is missing. I'm just testing to see how firmly attached to the metal the paint is, and the bad news is it's quite well attached to the metal and it's been there a long time. I engaged back gear on the lathe to slow it down. I'm using some extremely coarse sandpaper. It was very ineffective at removing the paint. Clearly this is not going to work. I need to use my special chisel. What's special about it? Well, as far as chisels go, it's quite safe. The end of it is ground flat. In this clip, I'm using the point of the chisel, which is flattened, to remove the paint. You will notice that it's not digging in and marking the metal. I'm not using this chisel as a chisel, I'm using it as a scraper, and it's scraping the paint off very well indeed. Because I can hold the tip of the chisel in my hand, I can use the side of the chisel to scrape off the paint as well. I'm quite happy with the way the strakes are looking at the moment, so I'm removing this wheel, and as soon as I've done that, I'm going to fit the other one. Here are the wheels on the workbench, and as you can see, they look quite good now. It's really pointless painting the outside of these strakes because immediately you use the traction engine, the paint gets chipped off. Back into the house now from the workshop, and I'm at the kitchen sink, which is full of warm water with a small amount of Carbusonic liquid added. Both of these wheels are now as good as they're going to get. The strakes are clean and the paintwork's clean. This small tin is a mixture of different paints. It started out as Humbrol red, but I kept changing it to match the colour on my large showman's engine. I thought I may as well use this small mixing tin in order to find the correct colour for the Allchin's wheels. I opened the tin of vermilion paint and it needed a really good stir. Everything had settled inside the can. And for that I'm using the handle of my old toothbrush, and in no time at all it goes from a watery brown colour to a nice bright orangey red colour. Mixing paint colours can be very difficult when you're just doing it by eye. You need a good light source, and I've got a good light source in the workshop. It's nice and bright and it's not fluorescent light. That's not so good. Now it's time to paint the flywheel with some etching primer. Here it is, and I'm squirting it into yet another aerosol can cap. I haven't shown it, but I shook the can vigorously to stir up the contents. This is etching primer, which will really bite into the metal and become a very good primer for a top coat. I'm not applying it very thickly, just evenly. I scraped off all the paint from around the inside of the rim of the flywheel, but I left the paint in place on the spokes because they're not too bad. Back now to the rear wheel that I've been working on, and it's time to paint around the edge. Don't do this first, because I can guarantee that you will touch the edge of the freshly painted wheel either with your hand or, in my case, my jacket sleeve. Now what I need to do is repair the very fine yellow line at this point. And as I've already mentioned, I'm not very good at this. I repainted the yellow line that ended up a bit too thick, then I overpainted it in red, and it looks okay. When working on old and neglected items, it's a good idea to check for mouse droppings. Or even worse, rat droppings. These are very small, so I think they're from mice. But even so, I don't want them in the bunker of the engine. While I was at it, I got rid of the overscale coal from the bunker. This coal's about the right size for coal firing the model, but some of the pieces were very overscale. In no time at all, my Henry vacuum cleaner does its job, and the engine's bunker is now devoid of mouse droppings and coal. As a general health and safety rule, if you find rodent droppings on your model, you need to clean it thoroughly. I'm using alcohol hand gel. And the good news is, because not as many people are buying it, it's now very cheap. I'm applying plenty of it into the area of the bunker where I found the mouse droppings. I gave the area 2 applications of this alcohol solution before wiping it clean with a cloth. And now, in my opinion, it doesn't pose a health risk, so I can work on it. I gave this area 2 coats of Humbrol satin black paint. This is the first coat. I didn't want to apply it too thick because I really didn't want any runs around the rivets. While I had the tin of Humbrol satin black in my hand, I applied this satin black paint wherever I'd previously applied etching primer. It looks a bit shiny at the moment, but once the paint's dried it should flatten off a bit. There was some damage to the paint on the top of the crosshead trunk guide. This needs repairing, but I'm not going to do it in the same way as it was originally repaired. It's very easy to drop 3 spots of black paint into any damage like this. The paint will spread out, and after a while your eye will get used to it. But I can't live with that. I'm going to try another method. I'm rubbing down the trunk guide using some wet to dry sandpaper. And here I'm wiping away the residue using a cloth. And now, as usual, I need to apply some of this stuff. Once again I spray some of it into the aerosol cap. Then I apply this paint very carefully to any damaged areas. And when this etching primer is rubbed down again with the wet to dry sandpaper and given a top coat of satin black, it should look a lot better. Here I'm giving the flywheel the first coat of paint using Great Northern Railway chocolate brown, which is not a perfect match for what was on there, but it's near enough. This is the trunk guide that supports the crosshead, and this is a second coat of paint. This part of the engine is very important because it's right at the top, and it's the first thing anyone's going to see when they look at the engine, and the original touch-up job on the damaged paint looked terrible. After this paint's dried, I will rub it down and give it a final top coat. This is a very important part. It's the bit that drives the wheels. It's keyed to the axle and pinned to one of the wheels. The drive pins at this side are not removable. The ones at the other side are, so you can disengage the wheel to use the winch. The viscosity of this paint is quite a lot thinner than some other paints that I use. That's because it's designed to flow and cover in one coat. Around the edge of this flywheel, though, I do think it's going to need another coat. Once the paint is dried and hardened, I'll rub it down and give it a second coat. After smearing some grease on the axle, I slid the driving block into place. Because this part is keyed to the axle and doesn't move, it didn't really need the grease, but I thought it was a good idea to prevent it from going rusty and sticking firmly in place. This clip shows the 2 driving pins in the holes at the back of the wheel. Now it's time to fit the wheel to the axle. Another coating of grease, to help waterproof the parts, which I do recommend if you're reassembling engines that are going to be running where there's likely to be water. I mentioned to the owner that I couldn't guarantee the boiler, nor could I test it. I cannot issue certificates. But just in case this owner or any future owner decides to run the engine on steam, this waterproofing method is a good idea. After applying a bit more grease to the end of the axle, I fitted the collar and inserted the pin. The pin went almost all the way in by finger pressure alone, but to get it into the final position I did have to tap it with the hammer once again very gently. Fitting the hubcaps was a simple yet fiddly job. This is the first one I dismantled, and it's the one that has a stud that is broken off. This axle needs a copious amount of grease. That's because when using the winch, the axle rotates freely in the bearing on the wheel. I was a bit puzzled by this. I had to fit the collar the other way around, because the securing pin didn't fit through the holes in the centre when I refitted the collar as it was originally the other way around. It's not important though, it's securely back together. And here once again I'm tightening the nuts that are fixed to the studs on the other side, and the wheel now rotates very freely because the drive pins aren't in place. Here are the pair of removable drive pins. I've cleaned one of them and the other one is just as it was when I took it off the engine. I don't want to polish these up, they wouldn't have been polished, they just need to be like clean steel. Both of these drive pins have a small fitting which allows them to be locked in position, because most of the time these drive pins actually drive the engine. As you can clearly see, this wheel is going round, the other one isn't at the other side because of the differential. To make sure everything was okay, I ran the engine up and down the bench. There's plenty of power at this wheel, and even running up and down the bench in this restricted space, the engine was very responsive in both directions. There was a problem with this lubricator. The check valve on it was blowing back, and I thought that if I put some standard lubricating oil in the lubricator, that means lubricating oil, not cylinder steam oil, which is very thick, the logic being that the thinner oil should unstick the valve, and indeed it has done. The lubricator is working perfectly, which is more than it did a few days ago. This image of the engine on the bench shows the difference in the colour between the front and rear wheels. The difference is quite subtle. The paint on the front wheels is a bit faded and generally quite badly chipped in places. You've previously seen me repairing the paintwork on the rear wheels and they look a whole lot better. When touching in paintwork, often the edges need a bit of attention, so it's top tip time. This is normally how I would do it. Most people will know what this is. It is a Sharpie permanent marker, and these are very useful for tidying up the edges of paintwork. Like I'm showing here, you can buy paint pens, but there are two problems with these. They tend to be a bit messy, you never know how much paint's in the tip, and the paint in the pens can attack the paint in certain cases. So for touching in black paint, I would use a Sharpie felt tip pen. This is a very small engine at 1.5 inch scale, and these are 10 BA nuts. These nuts are fitted too close to the hub, so I can't use a nut spinner, and even using a small spanner further damaged the paintwork on the hubcap. I removed most of the nuts using a pair of long nose pliers, which was much easier. This pin was quite tight in the hole, so I used an Allen key to tap it out, and then once I got it partially out, it pulled out easily with the pliers. I was surprised to find wear on this axle, which means that this engine has done quite a lot of running. I don't just mean sat on the bench with its flywheel going round, I mean physically running on the ground. The steering arrangement on this engine is completely wrong. This chain should go to the other side of the drum, because turning the steering wheel to the left makes the engine turn right. And what's even worse, one of the chains, complete with the fittings, is missing entirely. All I need to do is make some more fittings to fasten the chain to both the roller and the front drum. What I'm doing at the moment is turning the steering wheel, which turns the steering shaft, which in turn unwinds the chain. I do have a bit of a problem. The small Humbrol paint tin that I use for mixing the correct colour for the rear wheels is now just about empty. It's time to mix some more paint, I think. Normally I would do a test mix on a piece of cardboard, or in this case the top of an aerosol can. I start off with some Buffer Beam Vermilion Red. Then I add a small amount of Signal Yellow. This is a small amount of Signal Yellow, but it's very dominant. In this case, the vermilion doesn't need much yellow to make it the right colour. It's worth mentioning that both of these tins of paint are from the same manufacturer, Phoenix Precision Paints, so there shouldn't be any incompatibility. Some of the paintwork looks a bit rough, but do bear in mind that the magnification on some of these images is extreme. When I pan the camera back to a more natural size, everything looks a lot better. Time to give the pair of front wheels a good wash in the sink. This is very important, not only to clean the wheels before painting, to get rid of any residue from the mice that were living in and around the engine at some time. Once again, I added some of this carbusonic stuff that I use in my ultrasonic cleaner. Not a lot, I don't want to dissolve the paint, but it's really good at cleaning parts. And the temperature of the water in the sink is not hot, it's just fairly warm. I'm using my old pastry brush to clean these wheels, in exactly the same way as I did when I cleaned the rear wheels. I didn't use a toothbrush, that would be too aggressive. Before I paint these wheels, I will take them into the workshop and remove all of the black paint from around the edge. Hold the chisel underneath the centre line. That way it's less likely to slip, and if it did slip into the chuck would pull it away from me, not towards me. This job is more difficult than it seems, and it's almost impossible to repair the paint in one pass. As you can see here, quite a lump of it is missing, including the lining, which I will replace later. What I can't do is pile on the paint really thick onto the damaged area, because otherwise it will run and then it will look even worse than it does at the moment. This job takes a surprisingly long time to do. And on the front wheels, the lining is on both sides. This clip, for instance, shows the inside area of the wheel. Looking at some of this paintwork, I don't think it was painted all that well in the first place. I can see areas of paint missing around the rivets. These hubcaps are made from brass, and it would be nice to keep them in a brass finish and polish them, but alas, the rear hubcaps are painted black and they have some lettering on them. These images are a bit grainy because I filmed it last night and it was quite dark. Here is a can of self-etched grey primer that I'm going to spray on the hubcaps first. I placed the hubcaps on top of an aerosol cap and gave them a light coating of the etching primer. And quite early in the morning, the next day, I continued the job, but this time I'm going to use Phoenix Precision Paints Black Gloss. This is quite an old tin of paint, but there's nothing wrong with it, so it should be fine for the job. This fancy cap for the end of the cylinder is made from steel, not stainless steel. It's a little bit on the rusty side. The first thing I need to do is remove the piece of heat insulation, which thankfully is not asbestos. The part isn't very well finished on the inside, but that doesn't matter. The outside is well finished, but as you can see, it's a bit rusty and pitted. This is where the Myford ML7R lathe comes in very useful. The chuck is small, and it's perfect for clamping the part in position as shown. The job starts by using a long piece of wet-to-dry sandpaper. This keeps my hands away from the rotating chuck. To clean up the front of this part, I folded the sandpaper as shown, so it's quite a thick pad. Health and safety warning, when doing things like this, be very careful not to actually catch your hand in the chuck. This Myford is only a small lathe, but it really could bite. Using the wet-to-dry sandpaper dry didn't cut very well, so I sprayed the part with some WD-40, and this made a big difference. I refitted the heat insulation and pressed the newly cleaned up cap onto the end of the cylinder. The cap is held in place by one central bolt, and the threaded hole in the cylinder cover goes all the way into the cylinder, so I use some Loctite 542 on the bolt to avoid any leaks. When fitting things like this, it's very important not to over-tighten the securing bolt, because if you do, the end could become concave and it wouldn't look good. Please be aware that this is a sympathetic renovation, and I don't want it to look like it's got lots of new parts on it. It's not going to be perfect, but it will be much improved from the condition it was in when I received it. One of the steering chains and fittings was missing. But thankfully I still have one steering chain complete with fittings that I can copy. Here I'm checking the thread size, and this is a 7BA nut, which seems to fit. The fixings for the chain are not both the same. The threaded part on this one is shorter than on the other. What I need to know is what the diameter is of the eye part of this fitting. This is going to be quite a fiddly job, but I'm sure it will come out okay in the end. The diameter of the eye part of the fitting is 3/8 of an inch. The hole in the middle of the original fittings is 9/64 of an inch, so I'm drilling this out to 9/64 of an inch as well. I've drilled a hole for a depth of about 1.5 inches. That's because I'm using this round nose tool to shape one end, and then I'm going to use the same round nose tool to shape the other end and part it off. Parting off with round nose tools is not recommended, but it's very convenient as I will end up with a ring that is chamfered at both sides. I should be using lubricant for this job, I know, but it makes a mess of the video and it splatters on my camera too. Normally I would use Easy Flow No. 2 flux, but for steel I need to use this stuff. It's called Tenacity No. 5. First of all, I put some water in the plastic cap and then added some of the flux powder. For the job that I'm about to do, I need a very small amount of this stuff, but so I could show the viscosity of the mix, I mixed a lot. I would generally aim for a mixture that resembles double cream. And here I've applied some to the parts I'm going to silver solder. I'm going to use my small Proxon blowtorch, which, believe it or not, just uses standard butane for cigarette lighters. All I have to do is heat these parts to the correct temperature using the small blowtorch, and it didn't take very long. This is a very hot flame. When silver soldering, I would normally heat the part until the flux takes on a watery appearance, but I'm doing this slightly differently. I need a strong joint and I want plenty of silver solder to actually flow around the joint. And I bring the stick of silver solder close to the flame just before it's at the right temperature. And the heat of the blowtorch melts the silver solder, which deposits a blob on the work. Watch this. Once the silver solder melts and flows into the joint, I keep the heat on for a while to make sure the temperature is high enough. I want the silver solder to flow like this because I don't want the job to look like a metal ring just silver soldered onto a threaded bar. By doing it this way, with a generous amount of silver solder, when this part's cleaned up and painted, it will look like a forging. While the first part is cooling, I repeat the process for the second one. It's important to raise this part to the correct temperature. If it's not hot enough, the joint will be brittle. I'm not going to quench these parts, I'm just going to let them cool naturally. Why is that, you may be wondering? Well, the reason is simple. It's so cold in the workshop, my pot of water has frozen. The next thing I need to do is make 2 wire loops. There should be steel, but I can't find any, so brass will be fine. This is a very small traction engine, and this will be more than strong enough for the job. Now I need to change the shape of the part that I machined in the lathe. Using a countersink in my drilling machine, I'm countersinking each side of the centre of the part, and this is how I'm doing it, with a piece of wood to hold the part against the countersink in the drilling machine. This is also a very good test for the strength of the joint. If it drops to bits, then your silver soldering is not good enough. If that does happen, clean up the parts, re-silver solder them with plenty of flux at a higher temperature. The countersink is not good enough. I need to round off the countersink using this burr in my Proxon motor tool. This tool is quite vicious and you have to be fairly careful with it. The good thing is that it takes away a lot of the appearance of it being machined in a lathe. I made sure that both of these pieces of chain were exactly the same length. I've never worked with steering chains on a model traction engine before, and it puzzled me a bit because initially the chains were too long. And it took me a while to figure out how to adjust them so they were just the right length and remove most of the backlash in the steering wheel. I'm using a new soldering iron that I bought from B&Q, which has got a massive tip, and that makes a change. I tinned the tip using some multi-core solder, then held the tinned area of the tip underneath the link and applied some solder. Now it looks like this, and I think it will be fine. Especially when it's painted, which I'm doing at the moment. I found it easier to paint this item holding it in my hand. What is going on here? Bear in mind, to be honest, I don't know much about traction engines. I find them a bit strange. I think I prefer railway engines, because however nice traction engines look, they're still a basic horizontal engine sat on top of the boiler with a lot of gears that drive the wheels. I thought it would be a good idea, whilst thinking about this job, to just run the engine and take my mind off the fact that how can I be fooled by such a simple mechanism? I consulted the book that the owner sent me, and there was a general layout, but I still couldn't really figure out what was going on, and then the penny dropped. I'm going to run the engine for a while just to let you see it while I figure out what to do. Time for a bit of slow motion, I think. This is what I found. I was a bit puzzled why on the steering roller there was a flat on just one side, where the eyelet that supports the chain goes through the roller. And then the penny dropped. What you do is slacken off this nut, which is on the side that doesn't have the flat. You can rotate the eyelet fixing and the nut on the end of it goes into the slot. And this effectively removes the slack from the chain. I'm showing the difference here after just one turn. It's considerably better. At each side of the roller, I rotated the eyelets a bit more and tightened the nut to lock them in place. Now the chains are not too slack and there is a minimum amount of play in the steering wheel. In this clip you can see that there are basically 3 rows of chain around the roller, and both of the chains connect to the wheels from the centre of the roller. Simple yet very effective. I need to make a small peg to stop the gear lever from moving the gears into mesh when the engine is running. This is really not the best way to make this part, but owing to the fact that it's extremely cold in the workshop, it's going to have to do for now. I'm going to start with painting the flywheel. I already painted one side, but I need to give it another coat. And as I do like to rub down between coats, I thought this was a sensible way to do it. I'll just let the engine do most of the work. I'm using some 1200 grade wet-to-dry sandpaper, just to smooth off the white painted area that I painted in a previous episode. After cleaning up the paintwork with the wet-to-dry sandpaper, I used a cloth to get rid of any residue. I gave this side one coat of some very special paint. It's called One Shot, and it's designed for sign writing, so you can paint in one coat. The other reason for using this paint is that it's the only white paint I actually have in stock. I thought to myself, there must be an easier way to do this job, and it's staring me in the face. I turned on the compressed air supply to rotate the flywheel. Now, in theory, all I have to do is hold the brush against the edge. But it didn't work out as planned. It looked terrible, so it was back to plan A, paint the flywheel with its stationery. I still have to paint the centre part white as well. I forgot to do that in this final episode, so I will do it off camera once I've finished filming. When I first looked at the brown paint on this flywheel, I thought to myself, that looks very much like GNR, Great Northern Railway, chocolate brown. And when I looked in the book all about building the Allchin, that is indeed the specified colour for the flywheel, and the wheel colour is vermilion, but I found my vermilion paint wasn't a perfect match for the paint that was already on the traction engine wheels. Just in case you wonder why I'm using a hammer on the paint tin lid, it's to make sure it seals. There are some areas that were painted on this traction engine that I don't want to be painted. For instance, the regulator handle and the gear selector. The red paint was very badly chipped on both of these parts, owing to them being handled. That's why I scraped off the damaged paint, so there's nothing to chip in the future, and I've just noticed there's a bit more red paint needs removing. The state of the paintwork now on all of the wheels is a vast improvement from what it was before I started the job. I don't want to go too mad, I'm not painting every bit of the wheels. This wheel needs a coat of paint, it's badly marked, it's the steering wheel. I also repainted the cab hand wheels. Back now to the flywheel, and I'm trying to remove as much of the white paint from the brown part of the flywheel. And the next day I carried on with the job, this time painting the rest of the flywheel using Great Northern Railway chocolate brown. This job has not been difficult, it's just been incredibly slow and tedious. Matching the paint, being careful not to overpaint everything and make it look brand new. I'm actually leaving some of the oil and grease in some places to make the traction engine look like it's actually worked. The secret is knowing when to stop. It's very easy to get carried away with a job like this. Any badly chipped paint on the flywheel definitely needs replacement. You can clearly see that some of the red paint is damaged in this clip. Jobs like this are quite straightforward and very easy to fix, that is, provided that you use the correct colour. If you've been following this series, you will have seen the wooden planking that fits in the bunker. I'm going to use some satin varnish to seal this because it was surrounded by mouse droppings at one time. Although what I'm not going to do is varnish it like this and just leave it. I varnish both sides and then with a piece of kitchen roll I wipe off the excess varnish. And as soon as the varnish dries I can put this back in the bunker. This is a tin of HMG Paints LMS Crimson Lake gloss paint. This shade of Crimson Lake matches quite well with this small engine. I've sprayed some into the aerosol cap and I'm using a very small paintbrush. It doesn't look too good in this close-up image because it's highly magnified, but once it had all been done and the paint had dried, it was quite successful and a good match for the original paint. There were various chips around the engine, on the edges of things usually, so I just systematically went all the way around, and where there was a chip I patched it with the paint, and in some cases I painted a larger area to make everything match. I could paint the inside of the bunker, but I don't want to do that. That would make the engine look brand new in places and old in other places. It will be up to the owner to refill the bunker with some broken up coal, as the old stuff was dirty, too big and had mouse droppings in it. I think this old engine does look good now. It's very well made and I assume the boiler to also be as well made as the rest of the engine. I haven't done any work whatsoever on the boiler. That was not part of the agreed job. If the boiler's as well made as the rest of the engine, I think that it would quite easily pass a hydraulic boiler test, but that decision needs to be left to the owner, not to me. All I can say is that this is a very good example of an Allchin Royal Chester traction engine. And that is it, an Allchin Royal Chester renovation in 16 episodes. Stay safe, stay healthy, thanks for watching, and I hope you found it useful. Please take the time to visit my Mainsteam Models website and click on the section of the website that says Video Playlists. And by doing that, you can find other videos that you may like to watch. And by using the playlists, you can actually watch the videos back to back.